I'm going to come at it from a different perspective, but I think a complementary perspective as well, which is to talk about the link between the so-called deficit crisis, and Hugh has exposed admirably how it's been overestimated, exaggerated, promoted, and the underlying weakness in the real economy, the labor market and the provincial job creation scene, that I think is an ultimate cause of how we ended up in this situation in the first place. And this is where the austerity architects, of course, are trying to rewrite history and trying to get us to forget the fact that this big deficit crisis that we have is a relatively recent phenomena. In fact, until the recession, the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, we had no deficit crisis. We had no deficit, in fact. The evidence is obvious that the deficit is a consequence of the crisis, not the other way around. They often try to make it seem as if the deficit came first and everything else melted down around it. In fact, it was clear the crisis came first. The budget in Ontario was balanced for a decade. On average, until the 2008 crisis. There was 1 year of a significant deficit. That was the last year of the Harris-Eves government, where they were doing a bunch of spending to try and get themselves back into power and so on. Apart from that, and then on average over the whole decade, the provincial budget was balanced. The program spending increases that did occur in the initial years of the McGuinty government were more than paid for by the very modest recouping of some of the tax cuts that the Harris team had put in place. So until 2008, there was no deficit. So it's clear that the decline in employment and GDP that occurred in Ontario as a result of that financial crisis, accentuated by a couple of other factors, created the deficit that we're dealing with today. So this is an overview of the decade that led to the crisis. Apart from that 1 year, budgets were balanced on average across the whole decade. And then, of course, we ended up in the soup fiscally as a side effect of the underlying economic recession. And we, of course, understand the structural factors that went into that recession in terms of the role of the financial sector, financial market deregulation, speculation, and everything that came with it. The initial peak of the deficit for Ontario, the actual, as opposed to the initial forecast, was a significant deficit. A 3% of GDP deficit is a significant deficit for a sub-national level of government. But as Hugh indicated, it has started to decrease, and they never reached the alarming proportions that were initially projected. Now, this is the actual for 2011-2012. This is the current forecast, as Hugh indicated, for the deficit in the current fiscal year, which is about to end in March. And again, astoundingly, they're assuming that the deficit is actually going to grow again this year, despite all of the spending restraint and despite the gradual recouping in revenues that's occurring as the economic recovery continues. So this number is clearly not to be believed. Last year, they also projected initially that the deficit would increase even further. And of course, we have Don Drummond, who is projecting his status quo scenario that the deficit will actually grow to 5% of provincial GDP. Which is obviously, as Hugh showed, just an exercise in propaganda. So if it is an obvious truth that the recession caused the deficit, it is an equally obvious truth that fixing the recession is the best way to cure the deficit. And the numbers on that score are very obvious, even on a sort of back-of-the-envelope basis. What this graph shows is the course of Ontario's GDP over the last 15 years or so. And until the fiscal crisis, or the financial crisis of 08 and 09, you had a sort of an ongoing path of growth in nominal GDP of about 4.5%. Now, of course, we all understand in this room that nominal GDP is not the way to measure living standards, and growth in and of itself is not the end goal. What we want is jobs where we can produce the goods and services that we actually need and do it in a way that works for our society and our environment. So this is the increase in the way that we can measure it in terms of the official statistics. This was not a boom time, okay? It isn't fair to say that Ontario in the mid-2000s was in any kind of a boom at all. Remember, we were suffering hundreds of thousands of lost manufacturing jobs. We were already into the process of deindustrialization. The labor market was, gradually strengthening, but in no sense was it overheated. So in that sense, this should not have been considered unsustainable at all. So as a normal course of things, you should expect nominal GDP growth of around 5% a year if you count 2% inflation each year, and then the real growth, the real output that comes from putting more people to work and putting them to work more productively. That, of course, changed with the financial crisis and the recession. Our nominal GDP was unchanged for 2 years. Our real GDP after inflation was actually decreasing. And then we've had a recovery that has barely even kept up with what the trend should have been in the first place. It has not, as you see, closed the gap at all in terms of the lost output that we're still suffering because of the recession and the lingering effects of the recession. In fact, it still is a recession. Even though nominal GDP is growing, and real GDP is growing slowly, it is a recession in the sense that we're chronically underutilizing the resources that we have in our province. That gap between where nominal GDP should have been if we'd avoided the recession and where it is today is now $70 billion in Ontario's case. So if you do the simple math, we've lost $70 billion of GDP that we're still suffering today. We could be producing $70 billion more of goods and services than we are. The provincial government's typical share of GDP fairly consistently is around 17.5% of GDP, and as Hugh mentioned, that number has been stable. That translates into $12.4 billion in lost revenue immediately just because of the decline in GDP. The deficit last year was $13 billion, so that virtually accounts for the entire deficit right there. And even with the tax cuts and the legacy of them, it's still not reasonable to say that we have a dramatic structural deficit in Ontario. If we put people back to work, we would clearly be able to pay for the existing network of public services that we have. We can also look at it from the labor market perspective rather than from the GDP perspective. This is a graph that shows the employment rate in Ontario. I prefer to use the employment rate rather than the unemployment rate because the unemployment rate is increasingly misleading as an indicator of the health of the labor market because so many people have just given up looking, right? And when you give up looking, you disappear from the unemployment statistic. If instead you just ask the question, are you working or not? And even this doesn't tell the whole story because that doesn't get into the quality of the job that you have in terms of the hours, the security, the pay. Just ask if you're working or not as a proportion of the working age population. And we were around 63.5% in the years before the recession. We fell off the cliff, and then look what's happened in the years since. There's been hardly any recovery whatsoever. And all of the efforts, both by the provincial government and the federal government, to claim that the labor market is fixed, that we've won back the jobs that were lost, are just, again, nonsense because they ignore the fact that our population is growing each year. So getting back to the same number of jobs you had back in 2008 means nothing if your population has grown substantially in the time being. So we've hardly improved the employment rate relative to where it was in the worst time of the recession, which is stunning. And in fact, the employment rate in Ontario fell last year, which means we did create jobs, but not enough to keep up with population growth. This gap between the current level of the employment rate and the pre-recession level is 250,000 lost jobs. So we have $70 billion in lost output and 250,000 lost jobs in Ontario. This is a graph that shows labor income, wages, salaries, and supplementary labor income in Ontario again. And because of that decline in the employment rate, also because of wage restraint and downward wage pressure in the private sector and the public sector, the wage income that households in Ontario receive has fallen below its previous trend as well. And using the same methodology, comparing where we are today in wage and salary income versus where we would have been if the pre-recession trend had continued, we have lost over $50 billion of annual wage and salary income in Ontario. And we can do exactly the same sort of math. Imagine if we had $52 billion more income in the pockets of Ontarians. Just in the first order of the calculation, we've lost $5 billion of personal income tax revenue that the government would have collected on that income just using the middle class income tax rate. We've lost $3 billion in HST revenue from the people spending that additional income after they've paid their taxes. We've also lost $1 billion in employer health tax revenue, which is directly tied to payroll. That's $9 billion right there in direct tax revenue that's lost because of the chronic state of weakness in Ontario's labor market, let alone the second order impacts that would occur from those people actually spending their money, which in turn generates more income and employment throughout the economy. So the case is overwhelming that by putting Ontarians back to work, we would absolutely be able to pay for the current structure of public services in Ontario. We don't have to, for a minute, think that we can no longer afford these things, that we have to reinvent them, that we have to privatize them, or that we have to trample the sort of normal processes and rights and structures that we have in society, including collective bargaining. All we have to do is put people back to work, put them back to work, then they pay taxes, and then we can pay for those things absolutely. I think it's an increasingly obvious truth that the austerity response to the whole problem has a self-defeating contradiction within its own logic, which in an extreme situation can actually make the deficit worse. At a minimum, it isn't going to solve the problem as the architects of austerity are claiming, and in the worst case scenario can actually make things worse. Remember, this deficit was caused by the recession. The austerity response to the deficit is to cut spending, cut services, and lay off the people who provided those services. Well, obviously, that actually contributes to the condition of weakness in the labor market that created the recession in the first place. Now, do you lose $1 in revenue because of that side effect for every dollar that you cut? You don't know. It depends on how all of the other factors in the economy balance out. But in a best case scenario, you're going to lose a good portion of that dollar that you saved by cutting spending because of the negative side effects of the spending cuts on the economy. In a worst case scenario, depending on how all the other pieces of the economy fit together, you can actually reinforce or recreate the recessionary condition that caused the problem in the first place. We're now seeing this all over the world. We're recognizing this is exactly what's happening in Europe. The mindless austerity, which has obviously been more extreme than what we're experiencing, that's been imposed in Europe, actually has created another recession. The Eurozone is in a recession now for the last 3 quarters. You're in much more than a recession. You're in a social and economic meltdown in Greece and Southern Europe. You're in a triple dip recession, the 3rd recession in the UK now. Similarly, in the US, more and more critics are recognizing that the sort of mindless mechanistic austerity, which is what was built into that whole fiscal cliff debate. The whole fiscal cliff issue was the budget deal, which automatically forced the government to take measures, spending cuts and tax increases, to radically reduce the deficit. Mainstream economists recognize that would be a disaster in the same sense that the mindless austerity that was imposed in Europe has been a disaster. Despite the recognition around the world, in both Europe and America and elsewhere, of these negative and unintended consequences, if you like, of mindless austerity, Ontario, which came late to the austerity party, there's no doubt about it, now seems to be among the last of the true believers, if you like. It is useful to compare Ontario's situation to other provinces and to the federal level of government, and that's what this does. It shows the level of deficit experienced by each level of government as a percentage of GDP, and Ontario's deficit is the largest of any of the provinces. It also shows the anticipated reduction in program spending as a share of GDP in each of the provinces. And Ontario's austerity, which over that initial time frame is taking out about a percentage point of GDP in program cuts, is severe, but it isn't the worst. The interesting thing, and this again reinforces Hugh's point, that the whole thing is a construct, an ideological and political construct to facilitate a permanent and unnecessary downward shrinkage in the whole size of the public sector. Look at the 3 provinces in Canada that don't even have a deficit. They are, not coincidentally, the 3 provinces that produce oil: Newfoundland and Labrador, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Alberta has, in 2011, had a balanced budget. Saskatchewan and Newfoundland actually had surpluses. Yet the austerity that's being contemplated in those provinces, in Newfoundland, humongous cuts in program spending and public capital spending, and big cuts in both Alberta and Saskatchewan, in the provinces that least have any need to even consider it. And this shows again how even in a province where the economy is strong and where the budget balance is strong, this whole ideological construct of deficit phobia is being used to try and bring along the public for cutbacks that aren't at all necessary. Just a quick note, I'm sure some of you saw the coverage this week of this IMF working paper that came out from the high priests of neoliberalism suddenly waking up and realizing, oops, and the thing that pisses me off, the World Bank went through a similar epiphany a few years ago, and they never apologize. They never come out and say, gee whizzikers, we're sorry we destroyed your national economy with our bad advice. You know, they just come out and say some, you know, pointy-headed, obscure technical analysis seems to indicate, you know, unexpected forecast errors is how Blanchard describes it. But the gist of it is that they badly underestimated those macroeconomic side effects from the austerity. Their conclusion is now that $1 of spending cuts reduces GDP by $1.50. And that is consistent with kind of the traditional approach of sort of Keynesian macroeconomic models. Even the federal government, believe it or not, has a multiplier, something like that, built into its budget projections. And so again, depending on what else is happening in the economy, that negative multiplier, losing $1.50 of GDP for every dollar that you cut in program spending, depending on what else is being added or subtracted from GDP, can push you over the edge. In Ontario, we have already seen provincial spending falling by close to 1% of GDP. As Hugh's numbers indicate, that number would grow over the period to 2017 if all of the planned cutbacks are implemented. Federal and municipal program spending is falling as well. If you add that 1.5 multiplier to the number, you could easily be taking out at least 3% or more of national GDP over the next 2, 3, 4 years, depending on when the spending cuts are implemented. And depending on what other engines are in gear or not in gear, that could be indeed what pushes us back into a recession. These are the numbers for Canada. We can't get this breakdown for Ontario because of the data, but for Canada, this shows how the different components of GDP changed over the last 12 months. This is in the year that ended in the fall of 2012. That's the most recent data that we have. Consumers, bless their souls, are still borrowing like there's no tomorrow and spending, okay? Over the last year, there was also still growth in the housing construction side of things, in case you didn't notice all those cranes downtown, but we know that's going to cool off. We also know that's going to cool off. Government is already cutting. Total government spending, including capital spending, declined by about 1% over that period. Business investment is growing. That number looks good, but the 5% growth in business investment is from a very, very low base, and business investment is still weak compared to where it was before the recession, despite all the tax cuts. Our export performance has been miserable, largely because of the loonie, and so our overall GDP growth in Canada over that 12-month period was totally lackluster, 1.5%. That was over the 12-month period. Right now, this number is about 0. Right now, this number has shrunk because of the coming decline in the housing market, continued softness in consumer spending, and deeper cutbacks from the government side. So depending on what else is happening, the government cutbacks could realistically push Canada back into a recession, and then you get the knock-on effects coming after that. Those are the obvious points. The deficit caused the recession caused the deficit. Fixing the recession will fix the deficit, and austerity can actually make things worse. The not at all obvious question that we have to ask ourselves on the progressive side is, how do we solve that? How do we actually put Ontarians back to work? And this is where I think, honestly, we face a challenge to come up with a progressive jobs agenda that is credible, that we believe in, and that we think that we can sell to the public. The traditional engines of private sector growth in Ontario are not doing well. Our manufacturing sector, our exports, business investment has been weak, and we know that consumers and their private spending are going to slow down. The alternatives to that are going to require us to think very differently about how we organize the economy and what the leading forces of the economy are going to be. The mainstream, of course, doesn't want to go there. What they want to do is sort of forcibly harmonize our spending with very miserable economic outlook. We have to be able to go there, but we have to be able, I think, to develop our arguments in that area. And this is why we have the CCPA and all of the other resources that we're pulling together to help us do that collectively. It has to be more than just resisting the cutbacks. We have to have an agenda about how we put Ontarians back to work to pay for things going into the future. I was going to talk a little bit about this Jobs and Prosperity Council, but I think I'll save that perhaps for the discussion. This was 13 CEOs and me who were assigned by the provincial government to look at exactly this issue. And to try and even the odds in that debate, I agreed to tie one hand behind my back so that it was a fair fight between me and the CEOs. It did, to be fair, recognize the challenges around job creation and the failure of the private sector to put enough people back to work. It was actually honest about that. But I think it confronted a distinct lack of imagination from the private sector people and from government policy people, frankly. I was disgusted at the lack of ability to think and innovate on the policy front from the provincial government people there. It was pitiful. You know, back in the 60s and 70s, you would have had creative thinkers in policy thinking about how do we solve these problems. Today, we've got people who just spew back the neoliberal assumptions right back in your face and say, no, we can't do that, and by the way, we can't do that. And this is where we face a bigger challenge about changing public discourse, fertilizing the growth of new ideas, and taking it forward. So I'll save some of that for the Q&A and the discussion, but those are some numbers to say that, as Hugh said, the deficit was not caused by overspending. The deficit is caused by our failure to utilize the resources we have in society to produce the goods and services, including public services that we all need. So thank you, and we'll look forward to the discussion.